Harold Crane's 65 years old, and I spent the last 3 years playing the role of a helpless broke widower just to see if my own flesh and blood actually love me. Last Tuesday, my son-in-law threw a glass of ice water directly into my face in front of his wealthy business partners, laughing as he called me a pathetic freeloader. My own daughter stood mere feet away, sipping her imported wine, and simply looked the other way. I did not scream, I did not wipe my face. I walked away in absolute silence. The very next morning, I handed him an envelope he arrogantly assumed contained the deed to my home. When he opened it, the absolute terror of what was actually inside hit him so hard, he literally collapsed unconscious on his own patio. A fist came down on the marble kitchen island with a sound that rang through the entire room. Preston glared at me, his face burning with a cocktail of imported scotch and pure entitlement. He had on a custom suit that cost more than most people earn in 2 months, and he stood in a kitchen roughly the size of a standard suburban house. "I need that signature right now, Harold," Preston demanded, shoving a stack of legal documents across the cold marble surface in my direction. "I'm not asking you for a favor. I'm handing you a chance to actually pull your weight around here for once. I'm launching a high-frequency crypto investment firm on Monday. The initial capital requirements are massive, and my current assets are tied up in the commercial real estate ventures. Welcome back to His Hidden Revenge, the place where the truth always finds its way to the surface. If stories like this one speak to you, stay close and follow along, so you never miss what comes next." Before we go any further, I want to ask you something simple. Drop one word in the comments that describes how you are feeling right now in this moment. Just one word, let me know. This story contains fictional elements added to serve the telling of it, and any resemblance to specific real people or events is purely coincidental, but the heart of what it says that is absolutely real. The bank requires collateral on the bridge loan. You will hand over the deed to the guest house right now so I can draw against the equity. I held my ground motionless, taking in the aggressive young man who had taken my only child as his wife. My eyes dropped to the papers on the counter. What I was looking at amounted to a total forfeiture, a signed-away surrender of the sole property I was supposed to own anywhere in this world. "But Preston," I said, my voice flat, scrubbed clean of the anger smoldering behind it. "What you are proposing is that I surrender the deed to the place I sleep at night to bankroll a wildly unstable cryptocurrency venture. That is not an investment opportunity. That is a wager, and the stake is the last asset I have. My answer is no." Preston's response was a sharp, dismissive laugh that rang up through the vaulted kitchen ceiling. Across the room, 3 men glanced up from the custom dining table. Preston's prospective partners, all of them somewhere in their late 20s, the kind of men who parked European sports cars in the drive and communicated exclusively through corporate jargon. They watched us with mild, entertained curiosity. "That property is not yours, Harold," Preston said, advancing a step in my direction. "It is a structure on my land, a guest house on my estate. The only reason you have a roof at all is because I choose to tolerate your presence here. 3 years you have been here rent-free, ever since your wife passed. My chef feeds you. My utility bills keep your lights on. Do you have any conception of what it costs me to carry someone your age? I pulled my attention away from Preston and toward the woman on the opposite side of the kitchen island, my daughter Claudia. She stood in a silk evening gown, one shoulder against the cabinet, rotating a glass of deep red wine slowly in her hand. I held my breath and waited. I waited for the child I had raised from infancy, the one whose nightmares I had sat through, whose every achievement I had cheered, to look at her husband and demand basic decency. Claudia lifted her glass, drank slowly, then let her eyes find mine. What I saw there was empty. "Preston's right, Dad," she said. The words came out smooth, almost bored, and that casual indifference cut more cleanly than outright hostility. "We have gone out of our way for you. We have made room. You are a 65-year-old widower. What possible use do you have for financial autonomy? You don't go anywhere. You don't spend anything. Your entire existence is that garden and those old books. Preston is building something real for this family, and your stubbornness is the only thing standing in his way." Something cold settled deep in my chest, the full suffocating weight of understanding. The daughter I had given everything to had been hollowed out and filled with something else entirely. Standing in front of her, I was not her father. I was an inconvenience, a liability she needed cleared from the ledger. "Claudia," I said as gently as I could manage, "one last opening. If Preston's venture collapses and I've signed over this deed, the bank takes the guest house. I end up with nothing and nowhere. Does that genuinely not concern you? She exhaled sharply, rolling her eyes toward the ceiling. You are being absurd, she muttered, her wine glass clicking against the marble as she put it down. Preston knows what he is doing. This firm is not going to collapse, and if something went sideways, we would find you a decent place, assisted living somewhere suitable for your age. Stop making a scene and just put your name on the documents. I looked at the papers one final time. Then I slid them back across the marble surface toward Preston. No, I said. Quiet. Absolute. I will not surrender my home to underwrite your habit of gambling with other people's lives. We are finished here. Something shifted in Preston's face. The composed veneer fractured all at once. The cords in his neck went rigid beneath his silk collar. He was a man who did not absorb rejection gracefully under any circumstances, and absorbing it in front of an audience was something else entirely. His ego was constructed entirely on the premise of unchallenged authority, and an old man he considered worthless had just challenged it openly. You ungrateful old parasite. The words came out strangled, shaking. He moved without any pause, one hand snatching the heavy crystal glass of ice water from the counter and launching its contents across the space between us in a single vicious arc. The cold hit my face like a fist. Ice cubes struck my forehead and skittered loudly across the marble. Water flooded my glasses, streamed down my jaw, and soaked through the collar of my faded flannel shirt all the way to the skin. The physical shock registered and then faded. What replaced it was silence, a deep, total silence that swallowed the room whole. Somewhere behind me in the dining area, one of the partners laughed, low, satisfied. Preston loomed over me, breathing hard, his fury giving way to something that looked almost like pride. You're a freeloader, Harold, he said, one finger leveled at my soaked chest. Pathetic. A dead weight I've been dragging for 3 years. Sign those papers before tomorrow morning, or my people will carry your things out to the curb and rekey the guest house themselves. Get out of my sight. A slow drip fell from my chin to the floor. I did not lift a hand to my face. I did not raise my voice. I gave them nothing, not one visible flicker of the cold, colossal fury assembling itself behind my eyes. Slowly I turned to look at Claudia. I needed to see it. I needed to know if watching her husband assault her elderly father produced even a splinter of instinct in her revulsion. Guilt. Something human. Her face was a wall. She held my gaze for a moment, then turned away, retrieved her wine glass, and moved toward the dining room, as though I were a piece of furniture someone had left in the wrong place. That was the moment I buried the father I had been. I walked out, crossed the dark lawn, the night air working its way through my soaked clothes with every step. Inside the guest house, I threw the deadbolt, pulled the blinds, and stripped off my glasses. I dried them with a towel, one deliberate pass at a time. Then I went to the floorboard beneath my bed. I rolled back the rug, worked up the loose plank, and lifted out a compact steel-reinforced strongbox. I spun the combination, opened it. Nestled inside was a ruggedized, encrypted burner phone, untouched for over 5 years. I pressed the power button and watched the screen push a cold blue light through the dark room. The secure signal found its connection. I dialed from memory. 2 rings. Then a steady, unhurried voice. Good evening, Mr. Crane, Merritt said. Merritt, my voice came out like something carved from stone. The test is done. They failed every measure of it. Switch everything on. Lock down all shadow accounts. Open the forensic financial audit on Preston Voth and trigger the foreclosure protocols. We dismantle all of it. Understood, Mole. Merritt said, nothing in his tone suggesting surprise. Full activation by sunrise. I killed the call and returned the phone to the box. Preston believed he had made a fool of a helpless, penniless old man. What he could not have known was that he had just picked a fight with the man who held the title to the ground under his own feet. The assault itself was finished. The reckoning that followed had only just been set in motion. The neon sign above the midnight diner stuttered against the rain-slicked asphalt. 2 a.m, the streets were abandoned. I occupied a vinyl booth at the rear of the place, working through a cup of black coffee that tasted like scorched tar. Everything about that diner stood in opposition to the imported wine and cold marble of my son-in-law's kitchen. That was precisely why I had chosen it. Illusions, however expensive, were still illusions. The entry bell swung. Merritt came through the door, rain beating off his charcoal cashmere overcoat. He billed $2,000 an hour for his time as a senior partner at the most ruthless corporate law firm on the East Coast. And here he sat in a cracked vinyl booth at 2 in the morning, across from a man in a damp, cheap cardigan. He never once looked at the cardigan. Merritt knew who I was. He always had. He set a rigid titanium attaché case on the laminate table, put in a coffee order, with the hollow-eyed waitress waited until she had moved off, and then fixed his eyes directly on mine. "I'm sorry about what went down tonight." Harold Crane's voice was low and stripped of any real sympathy. "I pulled the security footage from the guest house cameras you had installed last month. The attack was unprovoked and legally actionable. We can move on criminal battery charges right now." I shook my head slowly, both hands wrapped around the ceramic mug to chase away the cold. A straightforward assault charge was nothing but a temporary nuisance. Merritt Preston would pay a fine, retain a defense attorney, and twist the whole affair to cast himself as the wronged party. He'd spin some tale about the strain of dealing with a senile father-in-law. I didn't want to inconvenience him. I wanted to take him apart completely. Crane nodded, his face shifting into something purely businesslike. He unlatched the rigid titanium attaché case. 10 years back, when my wife received her terminal cancer diagnosis, we sat through a long, agonizing conversation about what lay ahead. I had spent 40 years building Crane Global Logistics from a single delivery truck into an international supply chain empire. I was a titan in the industry, but behind closed doors, I was just a man terrified of losing the woman he loved most. Before she passed, she took my hand and warned me about the wealth. She told me that money draws in parasites, and that our daughter Claudia was already showing signs of a dangerous greed. She begged me to guard our legacy. So I vanished in plain sight. I sold the entire logistics empire to a private equity firm through a heavily fortified blind trust. I walked away with over $800 million fully insulated and completely untraceable. To the outside world, and more critically to my daughter, my company had simply collapsed under the weight of medical bills that had drained my accounts dry. I moved into their guest house and played the role of a defeated penniless widower. I wore cheap clothes. I drove a 12-year-old pickup truck. I needed to know whether my only child would still love me when I had nothing whatsoever to offer her except my presence. Tonight I got my final answer. The test was officially over. Crane drew out a thick stack of manila folders from the attaché case and lined them up with deliberate precision on the table. "Let's start with the primary residence," Crane said, flipping open the first folder. "Preston believes he's some kind of financial mastermind. He brags to his circle about the extraordinary mortgage rate he locked in on that $8 million mansion. He genuinely believes he outmaneuvered the market." A bitter, joyless laugh escaped me. Preston Voth was an arrogant fool. He hadn't secured a loan through any traditional bank. The boutique lending firm that bankrolled his extravagant lifestyle was a shell corporation that Crane had built. I was its sole shareholder. I literally held the mortgage on the house where Preston had just thrown water in my face. He'd demanded the deed to my modest guest house, completely blind to the fact that I owned the very ground beneath his feet. "He's missed 2 consecutive payments on the mortgage." Crane continued, tapping a manicured finger against a financial ledger. "He's funneling every liquid asset he has into this new cryptocurrency venture. The terms of the mortgage contract he signed are brutally strict. A third missed payment triggers an immediate default clause. We don't need a judge's order. We can initiate direct foreclosure and seize the property within 72 hours." I studied the figures on the page. For 3 years, I had watched Preston Voth strut around that mansion, treating the household staff like garbage, and treating me like a stray he'd taken in out of grudging obligation, all while I was quietly covering the property taxes he couldn't afford. All while, I was funding the illusion of his success from the shadows. "Initiate the default," I said, my voice colder than the rain streaking the windows. "He wants to talk about financial independence. Let's give him a masterclass in aggressive debt collection." Crane made a clean, swift notation on his legal pad. He didn't flinch. He was a precision instrument, and I was finally pulling the trigger. However," Crane said, pausing and lifting his eyes to meet mine with sudden sharpened focus, "the missed mortgage payments are the least of your son-in-law's problems. During the audit of his accounts to prepare the foreclosure, filing his forensic accounting team had turned up something far darker. Preston hadn't merely been making reckless investments. He had been actively committing federal crimes, and my daughter was entirely complicit. I felt my spine go rigid. I leaned forward, the diner falling away around me. Claudia was greedy, yes, but criminal conduct was an entirely different order of betrayal. "Show me," I said. Crane pulled a second folder from the attaché case. This one bore a red confidential stamp across the cover. He opened it to reveal dozens of bank statements, forged signatures, and shadow loan applications. The quiet war had just escalated from a lesson in humility into an unavoidable collision with the federal justice system. The folder sat heavier than the first one. It was dense with bank statements, notary stamps, and legal contracts. Crane pushed it across the table with the careful precision of a man sliding a live explosive across a surface. I opened the cover. The harsh fluorescent light of the diner fell across a stack of loan applications from 3 separate high-risk private lenders. I stared at the first page. It was a promissory note for $400,000 dated 6 months ago. At the bottom of the page on the line reserved for the primary guarantor was my name, Harold Crane. The signature was a remarkably faithful imitation of my own handwriting. I traced the ink's curves with my eyes. Preston hadn't practiced this casually. He had perfected it, spent hours studying how I wrote my name, likely lifting examples from the simple birthday cards I'd handed them over the years, or from the grocery lists I'd left on the kitchen counter. He had turned the mundane, intimate details of my daily life into instruments of high-level financial fraud. I turned the page. Another loan, $600,000, then another for $300,000. In total, over the preceding 6 months, Preston had secretly borrowed nearly $1.5 million against the fabricated equity of my guest house and my stolen identity. He had submitted false tax returns, manufactured bank statements, and tampered with digital notary seals. He had erected a massive, precarious house of cards with my name as its entire foundation. Crane leaned forward, his voice steady as a hum of rain hitting the diner window. "Your son-in-law has been lying to everyone," Crane said evenly. "His commercial real estate ventures aren't just underperforming, they're completely bankrupt. He owes millions to aggressive private creditors who don't operate by standard banking rules. The cryptocurrency firm he was boasting about tonight isn't a new business venture. It's a frantic, desperate attempt to gamble his way out of a massive financial crater." Crane pointed to a highlighted line on the third bank statement. "He needed your signature tonight to lock in a final bridge loan because his shadow lenders have officially cut him off. He's drowning in debt of his own making, and he decided to use you as his life raft. He bypassed standard banking security by going through unregulated private equity lenders who don't scrutinize the paperwork too closely, as long as the collateral looks solid on the surface. And to them, a retired widower living on a luxury estate looked like perfect silent collateral." A sickening twist hit me in the stomach. It wasn't the money. The money was entirely beside the point to me. I had hundreds of millions safely held in blind trusts. It was the sheer calculated malice of it all. Preston Voth had looked me in the eye every single day for 6 months. He had eaten meals I occasionally cooked. He had smiled at me across Sunday dinners, all while systematically stealing my identity and plotting my total financial ruin. He'd had the audacity to call me a freeloader tonight while he was actively robbing me blind. But the darkest revelation was still ahead. Crane watched my face, carefully reading my emotional state before he chose his next words. "Look at the guarantor sections on page 4 of each contract," Crane said quietly. "Look at the cosigner lines." I turned to the 4th page of the thickest loan document. Right below my expertly forged signature sat another name, Claudia Voth. It was not a forgery. I had watched my daughter write that exact signature on homework assignments when she was a little girl, on her college applications, and on her marriage certificate. It was hurried looping and unmistakably hers. The air in my lungs turned to heavy ash. I couldn't breathe for a long moment. I could process Preston being a monster. I had never truly trusted him from the day they met. But Claudia was my own flesh and blood. She had known everything. She hadn't merely turned a blind eye to her husband's arrogance or his casual cruelty toward me. She was an active, willing participant in a federal crime against her own father. She had sat in that kitchen tonight sipping her imported wine, telling me I owed them for my room and board, fully aware that she had already helped steal over $1 million in my name. I thought about the logistics of the crime. Preston could not have pulled this off alone. Claudia had to have intercepted my mail. She had to have handed him my old tax documents from the attic. She exploited her position as my trusted daughter to enable the theft of my identity. She co-signed the fraudulent documents, Crane said, breaking the heavy silence that had settled over our table. She authorized the transfer of the stolen funds directly into their joint accounts. She is not some naive victim of his manipulation, Harold. She is a full co-conspirator. If we hand these dossiers over to the federal authorities, your daughter will be indicted right alongside him. She'll face multiple counts of wire fraud, identity theft, and bank fraud. She's looking at a minimum of 5 to 10 years in a federal penitentiary. I closed the folder. The cardboard cover came down against the table with a flat final sound. The diner had gone quiet around us. The tired waitress was dragging a cloth across the counter at the far end of the room, entirely unaware that a family had just been hollowed out completely in booth number 4. I thought about Claudia turning her back on me when Preston hurled that freezing water in my face. I thought about the utter blankness in her eyes when I asked whether she was comfortable putting me out on the street. My entire life I had tried to shield her from the world's hardest edges. When her mother died, I made a promise that I would always keep her safe. I had constructed a massive empire, precisely so she would never have to know the sting of poverty or desperation. I had willingly crammed myself into a small guest house in cheap clothes just to stay close to her, and in return, she had chosen to feed me to the wolves for a few more months inside a counterfeit mansion built on stolen money. I looked across the table at Crane. The suffocating grief that had been pressing down on me for the last 10 minutes slowly lifted, and in its place came a cold, impenetrable armor. I understood then that the daughter I had loved was gone, had been gone for a long time, replaced by a greedy stranger who saw me as nothing more than a resource to drain and discard. She made her choice. Chronopisp. I said, my voice carrying not a trace of hesitation or sorrow. I am no longer her father, and she is no longer my daughter. They are simply two criminals who have made a fatal miscalculation. Prepare the evidence for the federal prosecutor. We will deliver the dossiers directly to the authorities first thing in the morning. We will not give them warnings. We will not give them the chance to negotiate or retain defense attorneys to hide the money. They wanted to play a high-stakes game with my life and my dignity. Now they're going to learn what happens when they sit across a table from a man who secretly owns the entire casino. Crane nodded his face, a mask of absolute professional resolve. He stacked the folders back into the rigid titanium attaché case and snapped the brass locks shut. The sound landed like a cell door closing. The quiet machinery of their destruction was now fully in motion. Preston thought he had won the war by humiliating an old man in front of his crowd. He had no idea his entire existence was about to be dismantled by the very man he had written off. Crane reached into the bottom of the attaché case. I had assumed the financial ruin was the final blow, but the grim set of his jaw told me we weren't done. He produced a single thin manila folder, distinct from the dense financial records we had just worked through. He set it squarely in front of me, resting his hand flat on top of it for a moment, as if bracing me for what was inside. This wasn't turned up by the forensic accountants, Crane said, his voice dropping to a quiet, dangerous register. This was flagged by the cybersecurity team monitoring the corporate servers. Preston is not a very smart criminal, Harold. He used his company email, the company technically owned by your trust, to correspond with a bottom-feeding probate attorney. We have full legal access to those communications. Read this carefully. I opened the thin folder. Inside was a printed email chain and a drafted legal document. I looked at the title, Petition for Emergency Conservatorship. The words sat on the page like a physical threat. I worked through the legal language, my eyes moving across each paragraph, and a new and far deeper horror began to settle over me. This was not a loan application. This was a petition to have me declared legally incompetent, a formal request to the state to strip away my basic human rights, my bodily autonomy, my financial independence, my say over my own life. I read the specific claims laid out in the petition. Preston and Claudia were alleging that I was suffering from rapidly advancing dementia. They claimed I was prone to violent, unpredictable outbursts. My blood ran cold as I reached a specific paragraph describing the events of tonight. According to the petition, I had attacked Preston in the kitchen during a paranoid delusion, and Preston had been forced to restrain me. They were repackaging his assault on me as fabricated evidence of my mental deterioration. Crane watched my eyes move across the page. They are planning to file this on Monday morning, he said. They're requesting an emergency ex parte hearing. That means they want the judge to hand them temporary control over you before you even have the opportunity to defend yourself or secure your own legal counsel. Once that order is signed, Harold, you cease to be a free man. They would have the legal authority to have you committed to a locked psychiatric facility. They would hold total control over every bank account, every medical decision, every aspect of your existence. You would not be permitted to drive to vote or even to choose what you eat for dinner. I turned to the second page of the document. It was an affidavit fully drafted, waiting only for a final notarized signature. It was written from my daughter's perspective. I read the words Claudia had supposedly dictated to the probate attorney. She claimed she was frightened of me. She claimed there were days I no longer recognized her, that I was a danger to myself, and that placing me in a secure medical facility was the only compassionate path left available to the family. She was prepared to stand before a judge and swear under oath that her father had lost his mind, all so her husband could secure collateral for a fraudulent cryptocurrency scheme. I realized she must have been watching me for weeks, bending innocent moments into fabricated medical symptoms. If I set down my reading glasses somewhere and forgot them, she logged it as cognitive decline. If I chose to sit quietly in the garden rather than endure Preston's boasting, she framed it as depressive withdrawal. She had weaponized the stillness of my daily life to build a cage around me. The financial theft was a crime of greed, but this petition was something else entirely, an act of pure, unadulterated evil. They didn't just want my money. They wanted to erase me. They wanted to seal me inside a white room until I stopped breathing so they could sustain their lavish lifestyle without the inconvenience of my continued existence. I raised my eyes from the document. The diner around me felt impossibly remote, as though I were observing it from beneath deep water. The betrayal was so complete, so fundamentally unnatural, that it registered as a physical weight bearing down on my chest. I had spent my entire adult life constructing a fortress to protect my family, and my own daughter was now forging the very chains she intended to lock me in. "This changes the parameters of our response," Crane said evenly, cutting through the silence. "We are no longer simply protecting your financial assets. We are protecting your freedom. If they manage to file this petition on Monday, it will trigger a mandatory investigation by Adult Protective Services. It will drag us into probate court. It will hand them leverage. We cannot allow this document to see the light of day." I closed the folder. The paper felt poisonous under my hands. The cold armor that had formed around me the moment I saw Claudia's signature now hardened into solid steel. Whatever remained of my paternal instinct, any last fragile ember of hope that my daughter might one day find her way back, was extinguished permanently. She was no longer a misguided child. She was an active and dangerous predator. I understood in that precise moment that simply leaving their property was not enough. Cutting off their funding was not enough. I needed to surgically remove them from my life entirely. I needed to guarantee that they would never, under any circumstances, hold the power to threaten my freedom again, and I needed to accomplish it before Monday morning. "You're right, Crane," I said, my voice carrying an eerie calm. "We can't let the foreclosure simply grind through its course in the background. We need to paralyze them completely. We need to hit them so hard and so fast they don't have the breath left to utter a single lie before a judge." I glanced at the digital clock burning red above the diner kitchen. It was 3:08 in the morning. Preston was hosting his investor brunch on the patio later that morning. He was going to strut around his counterfeit mansion, serving expensive food purchased with stolen money, working to lock down the final piece of his fraudulent scheme. He expected me to walk out there and hand him the deed to the guest house. He expected me to fold. I want the foreclosure notice finalized and sealed." I said, my mind moving with the crystalline focus of a man fighting for his survival. "I want the federal indictment referral on the wire fraud prepared and ready to submit. But more than anything, I want a printed copy of that exact drafted conservatorship petition. Put all 3 documents into a single heavy envelope." Crane lifted an eyebrow, a brief flicker of genuine respect crossing his otherwise composed face. "You're going to hand him the trap yourself." "Exactly," I replied. "He wants a document from me tomorrow morning. I'm going to give him precisely what he asked for. I want him to open that envelope in front of every investor he's trying to impress. I want him to read the foreclosure notice and understand he is homeless. I want him to read the federal fraud referral and understand he is headed to prison. And I want him to see his own drafted conservatorship petition so he knows with complete certainty that I am fully aware of the monster he is. We execute the legal freeze on all their banking assets at exactly 8 Salzers tomorrow morning." Crane confirmed it with quick, efficient notes on his pad. By the time he tears that envelope open, his credit cards will be worthless. His accounts will be locked solid. He won't be able to buy a cup of coffee, let alone engage a defense attorney to stop the foreclosure. And Claudia, I added, feeling one last brief hollow ache in my chest before I sealed it away forever. When the bank freeze goes through, make sure her personal accounts are included. She co-signed the fraudulent loans. She carries full legal liability. Strip her of every single penny. Consider it done, Harold, Crane said, shutting the attaché case for the last time that night. He slid out of the booth and rose, buttoning his coat. I'll have the envelope delivered to the guest house by courier before 9 in the morning. Try to get some rest. Tomorrow is going to be a very destructive day. I watched Crane move out into the rain, the diner's neon sign throwing broken light across the wet pavement. I didn't feel tired. I ordered another cup of black coffee and sat alone in the stillness for a long time. I thought about the little girl who used to grip my hand as we walked through the park. I grieved for her. I mourned the daughter I had lost. But the woman currently living in that mansion was an enemy who intended to steal my freedom. I finished the coffee pushed up from the booth and stepped out into the cold night air. I drove the 12-year-old pickup truck back to the sprawling estate. I parked without a sound and walked into the guest house. I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark living room and watched the sun climb slowly over the manicured lawns. I waited for the courier. I waited for the morning. I waited to take their world apart completely. The sun came up over the estate's manicured lawns, throwing long golden shadows across the imported stone patio. It was a beautiful Saturday morning, the kind that felt entirely at odds with the ugly reality of the people who occupied the house. From the window of the guest house, I watched the catering staff pull up in a spotless white van. They'd unloaded silver trays carrying shrimp cocktail platters, imported prosciutto, and tall crystal champagne flutes. Preston was staging his brunch, pulling out every available stop to impress the 3 private equity investors he desperately needed to bankroll his fraudulent cryptocurrency venture. Preston's voice carried clearly across the garden. He was laughing at full volume, a forced booming sound engineered to project unshakable confidence. He stood at the head of the long teak dining table in a crisp linen suit, sweeping his arm across the sprawling estate as he spoke. He spun stories for the investors about the property's supposed history, claiming he had acquired it for a bargain and transformed it with his own singular vision. He was selling them a carefully constructed illusion of financial dominance and limitless wealth. He gestured toward the luxury sports cars gleaming in the circular driveway. He poured $1,000 champagne into their glasses with a generous hand. He held forth at length about his exacting ethical standards and his razor-sharp risk management strategies. He was the perfect image of a young, unstoppable industry titan. Claudia stood right beside him, in a designer sundress, smiling and nodding at every fabrication her husband produced. She performed the role of the devoted, successful wife without a single crack in the facade. She directed the catering staff with clipped, impatient gestures, treating the waiters with the same casual contempt she had shown me the night before. She had absolutely no idea that precisely 2 hours earlier, at 8:00 sharp, Crane had executed a complete legal freeze on every bank account tied to her name. She was standing on a foreclosed patio, consuming expensive food she could no longer pay for, utterly blind to the financial guillotine suspended directly above her head. Inside the quiet shelter of the guest house, I did not reach for my usual worn-out khaki pants or the faded flannel shirt. Those clothes belonged to a character I had finished playing. The test was over, and the season for humility had ended. I went to the back of the closet and unzipped a heavy canvas garment bag. Inside hung a bespoke charcoal gray suit, custom-tailored for me in Milan during my final year as Chief Executive Officer of Crane Global Logistics. I pulled on a crisp white dress shirt. I fixed a dark silk tie at my collar. I stepped into a pair of hand-stitched leather derbies that had once crossed the floors of international boardrooms. When I stood before the full-length mirror, the frail, defeated widower had vanished entirely. The man looking back was the man who had built a global empire from a single delivery truck. My posture corrected itself, shedding years of calculated submission. The resolve returned to my jaw. I picked up the sealed white envelope resting on the kitchen counter. It held the formal foreclosure notice, the federal fraud indictment referral, and the drafted conservatorship petition. It wasn't merely paper. It was the physical embodiment of their total destruction. I walked out of the guest house and moved across the manicured lawn toward the patio. I didn't shuffle. I moved with the measured, deliberate stride of a man who owned the ground itself beneath him. The morning breeze worked its way through the fine fabric of my suit. The gravel pressed and shifted under my shoes, a steady rhythmic sound like something approaching that couldn't be stopped. As I drew closer to the patio, the lively conversation among the investors began to lose its momentum. One of the men, an older gentleman, silver-haired with a sharp and practiced gaze, noticed me first. His attention drifted from Preston and locked onto me. He recognized the unmistakable quality of genuine authority. He recognized the cut of a $10,000 suit. He saw a man who bore absolutely no resemblance to the pitiable, burdensome father-in-law Preston had surely described to them. Preston registered the shift in his audience and turned around. His smug smile faltered for just a fraction of a second when he saw me coming. He blinked, visibly thrown off his footing. He had been expecting the broken old man he'd assaulted with ice water the night before. He had been expecting a trembling hand delivering a surrendered deed. What he was looking at instead was a figure of undiluted corporate authority. But Preston's ego was far too enormous to let him register the danger standing directly in front of him. He snapped his smirk back into place and turned to his investors with a smooth, dismissive wave of his hand. Gentlemen," Preston announced, his voice carrying across the patio to make sure everyone caught every word. "This is my father-in-law, Harold. My apologies for the interruption. I mentioned he's been going through a rather difficult transition period. It appears he decided to dress up for the occasion." Claudia turned and stared at me, her eyes tightening with deep confusion. She studied the expensive fabric of my suit, then dropped her gaze to the thick white envelope in my right hand. Preston stepped away from the table and moved quickly in my direction, deliberately positioning himself between me and his guests. He dropped his voice to a hard, low demand, though his expression held a practiced, cordial smile for the audience behind him. "You actually put on a suit?" Preston muttered, his eyes sliding hungrily down to the envelope. "I assume that's the signed deed to the guest house. Good. You finally realized you have absolutely no other choice. Hand it over right now. Go back to your little room and let me finish securing this capital." I did not hand it to him immediately. I stood perfectly still, looking directly into his eyes. I wanted to burn the smug, self-satisfied expression on his face into my memory. I wanted to hold on to exactly how he looked in those final seconds of imagined victory before I stripped everything away. The investors watched us in silence, picking up on the sudden, thick tension radiating between us. The morning birds went quiet. The soft clinking of silver against porcelain stopped altogether. The stage was set. I stepped fully onto the imported stone patio, the weight of my hand-stitched leather derbies landing in a slow, deliberate rhythm against the stone. The three private equity investors sat motionless, their eyes following my every step. These were men who built their careers reading a room, weighing risk, and recognizing real power when it walked toward them. Right now, all their finely tuned financial instincts were screaming that the story they'd just been sold was fundamentally wrong. The man they had been told was a broke, senile liability was crossing the patio in a custom suit that cost more than most people earn in 2 months, carrying himself with the absolute bearing of a king surveying conquered ground. I did not look at the investors. My eyes stayed locked on Preston. He stood at the head of the long teak dining table, a crystal champagne flute frozen halfway to his lips. The dismissive smirk he'd been wearing just moments before was beginning to fracture at the edges, replaced by a flicker of nervous energy he couldn't quite contain. The morning breeze carried the scent of expensive catered food and blooming jasmine, a sharp contrast to the raw hostility radiating from the center of that patio. Preston set the glass down on the table. The crisp ring of expensive crystal against polished wood cut through the tense morning air like a gunshot. He forced a wide, patronizing grin, desperately trying to reclaim command of a stage he believed was his. He puffed out his chest and produced a loud, theatrical laugh, turning to wink at the wealthiest investor seated to his right. He was running a dangerous bluff, trying to convince these powerful men that my sudden commanding presence was nothing more than an eccentric family quirk. He moved 2 steps in my direction, extending his hand the way a man extends it to a subordinate who has finally learned where he stands. His eyes landed on the thick white envelope in my right hand, lighting up with naked greed. Finally, the old man understands how business works. Preston said, his voice soaked in a syrupy condescension that drifted across the quiet garden. He reached out, fingers twitching with anticipation. "Did you bring the signed deed, Harold? It's about time you stepped up and contributed to this family. I'm glad you finally came around. Just hand it over, and we can get back to securing this company's future." Claudia emerged from behind her husband, crossing her arms over her designer sundress. She looked me up and down, her face twisting into a bewildered, contemptuous sneer. She could not process what she was looking at. "Where did you even get that suit, Dad?" She snapped, her voice laced with pure venom and a thread of genuine unease. "Are you trying to embarrass us by dressing up like a banker? Give Preston the papers and go back to the guest house right now. We are in the middle of a highly confidential corporate meeting. You are out of your depth and you are ruining this morning." I did not look at my daughter. She was already a ghost to me, a complete stranger standing in a house she no longer had any legal right to occupy. I focused entirely on the arrogant young man reaching out for his own destruction. I didn't hand him the envelope right away. I held it suspended in the air between us, making him wait, making him feel the seismic shift in gravity. The silence expanded, heavy and airless. The investors adjusted in their padded teak chairs. They could sense blood in the water. They understood that a transfer of power was unfolding directly in front of them, and they understood that Preston was not the one holding it. I looked Preston straight in the eye, peeling away the false image of the frail, helpless old widower he'd exploited the night before. I let him see the cold, absolute ruthlessness of the man who had dismantled international rivals for 4 decades. I let him look into the eyes of a true corporate titan who was about to take his entire world apart, piece by piece. The arrogant curl of his mouth faltered for just a fraction of a second, as a tiny seed of genuine fear finally planted itself in him. "I brought exactly what you asked for, Preston," I said. My voice was barely above a murmur, a lethal calm that made the warm morning air feel instantly colder. "I brought the documents that will permanently secure your future." I held out the sealed white envelope. Preston snatched it from my hand with a triumphant smirk, quickly burying that split second of fear under a thick coat of delusion. He was eager to perform his dominance for the audience watching in silence. He turned the package over in his hands, completely blind to the fact that he was holding the legal equivalent of a live grenade. He believed he was holding the key to his financial rescue. He had no idea he was holding the precise blueprint of his coming prison sentence. He slid his thumb beneath the sealed flap, ready to display his prize. Preston tore the top of the envelope with eager, clumsy fingers. He was so desperate to claim his final win that he ripped a small corner of the actual documents inside. He let the torn scrap fall carelessly onto the pristine stone beneath his feet, a piece of trash dropped on an estate he wrongly believed he commanded. He pulled out the dense stack of papers with a broad, self-satisfied smile. There was no immediate exhale of relief, no triumphant laughter. He had expected a standard property deed signed in blue ink at the bottom. Instead, he was staring at a thick bundle of heavily formalized legal documents bearing the severe and intimidating letterhead of the most aggressive corporate law firm on the eastern seaboard. The top sheet was printed on heavy textured paper. Preston shifted his stance, holding the page up toward the morning sun, as though the glare was the reason the words weren't making sense. I watched his eyes move across the bold, capitalized letters at the top of the page. Notice of immediate foreclosure and seizure of property. I saw the exact moment his brain tried to reject what it was reading. He blinked rapidly, gave a small, involuntary shake of his head. His eyes dropped to the property address printed in the center of the page. It was his address, the very ground he was standing on. Then his gaze moved to the name of the holding company that carried the mortgage. It was a boutique lending firm he recognized, one he'd gone to in desperation over the past 3 years while hunting for more funding. And directly beneath it, in clean, unmistakable print, was the name of the sole proprietor of that holding company, Harold Crane. Preston looked up from the page, every trace of arrogance wiped clean from his face. He stared at me with wide, hollow eyes. His mouth opened to demand an explanation, to scream a denial, something, but the words dissolved completely before they reached his lips. He looked back down at the paper. The document laid out the exact dates of every missed payment, the full amount of his delinquent debt, and the 72-hour eviction notice. In that agonizing moment, he understood he was not a wealthy estate owner. He was a trespasser on my land, but the foreclosure was only the outermost layer of his destruction. His hands began to tremble, the thick stack of papers rustling loudly in the still morning air. He flipped the foreclosure notice aside, frantic to find some error, some cruel joke buried in the pages. He found the second document waiting for him. It was the formal federal indictment referral. I watched the color drain from his face, leaving his skin a sickly grayish pallor as he read through the charges: wire fraud, identity theft, federal bank fraud. The document cataloged every shadow loan he had quietly taken out over the previous 6 months, the exact dates, the exact dollar amounts, the exact private equity lenders he had actively defrauded. The legal summary spelled out in explicit detail how he had forged my signature across multiple high-value promissory notes. It also named his wife as an active and willing co-conspirator in the financial crimes. Preston understood then that I hadn't simply glanced at his current bank balances out of curiosity. I had forensically dismantled his entire criminal history piece by piece. I had assembled enough ironclad evidence to put him and his wife in a federal penitentiary for a decade. That realization landed on him with the physical force of a freight train hitting a wall. He dragged in a sudden ragged breath. A fat bead of cold sweat formed at his temple and traced a slow line down his jaw. He was no longer a visionary entrepreneur. He was a cornered felon staring at his own impending sentence. The 3 private equity investors at the teak dining table were not fools. They had spent entire careers reading the early signs of corporate panic and financial collapse. They watched Preston come completely apart in the span of 30 agonizing seconds. The poised young visionary who had just been pouring expensive champagne and boasting about his brilliant risk management strategies was now sweating and shaking like a trapped animal. The oldest investor slowly pushed his padded chair away from the table, putting physical and professional distance between himself and Preston. He laid his expensive linen napkin quietly on the table. The 3 men exchanged silent, knowing looks. They had just figured out that the man pitching them a high-frequency cryptocurrency venture was concealing a massive catastrophic secret. Claudia noticed the severe change in her husband's body. She moved toward him, her designer heels clicking against the imported stone. "Preston, what is it?" Her voice had gone tight with sudden uncontrollable anxiety. "Preston, what did he give you?" Preston couldn't answer. His throat had closed entirely around pure primal terror. His chest heaved as he fought to pull air into his lungs, but his panic was smothering him from the inside. He blindly turned to the final document in the stack. He couldn't imagine it getting any worse. He thought the loss of his home and his freedom was the very floor of the abyss. But I had saved the most devastating page for last. It was a printed copy of the drafted petition for emergency conservatorship. The exact email he had sent to a bottom-feeding probate attorney at 2 a.m. The cruel and deliberate document in which he and Claudia had conspired to have me declared mentally incompetent and warehoused in a locked psychiatric facility. I watched his panicked eyes find the familiar words he himself had typed just hours earlier. This was the final killing blow. He understood that I knew absolutely everything. I knew about the financial theft, but more than that, I knew about the profound ugliness buried in his soul. He grasped that I had full access to his secure corporate servers. He understood there was nowhere on earth he could go that was beyond my reach. I had cornered him financially, legally, and psychologically all at once. The walls of his counterfeit life caved inward, simultaneously crushing him flat. He looked at me one last time. He did not see a frail old widower. He saw the architect of his total destruction. He saw a titan who had just executed a flawless checkmate. The physical response was immediate and savage. Preston let out a high, strangled gasp, as though all the oxygen had been vacuumed out of that beautiful garden in a single instant. His hands lost every trace of strength. The thick stack of legal documents slipped from his fingers and scattered across the imported stone. The white pages drifted in the morning breeze, settling near the expensive shoes of the investors he had been trying to court. Preston reached up and clawed at his own throat, his eyes rolling back. The color evacuated his face completely, leaving him looking like a polished wax figure. His knees gave out beneath him. He didn't stumble. He didn't sway. He simply dropped like dead weight, collapsing cold onto the hard patio, his body hitting the ground with a sickening hollow thud. He fainted dead away at the feet of the powerful men he had been desperately trying to swindle. Claudia let out a piercing, horrified scream that rang out across the manicured lawns. She dropped to her knees beside him, seizing his shoulders and shaking his limp body in frantic, useless bursts. The three investors rose from their chairs at once. They did not move forward to help. They took several coordinated steps backward, their expressions hardening into masks of cold, professional contempt. They looked down at the legal documents littering the ground. The oldest investor's eyes caught the bold red stamp of an FBI indictment referral on one of the pages resting near his shoe. He read the words wire fraud plain as day in the morning light. He grasped with chilling clarity how close he had come to wiring millions of dollars to a desperate criminal. The investors moved away from the table, leaving their champagne glasses untouched and full. They were putting distance between themselves and the wreckage without a backward glance. I stood perfectly still, watching the complete collapse played out at my feet. I didn't crouch down to offer help. I didn't call for a doctor or a glass of water. I simply straightened the crisp cuffs of my bespoke charcoal suit. Preston thought the confrontation was finished because his body had forced him under to escape the terror. He didn't understand that his collapse was only the opening act of the nightmare ahead. The investors now knew he was a fraud down to the bone. The money he so desperately needed had evaporated for good. The silent war had just shifted into a very loud, very public execution. The morning sun kept warming the imported stone beneath our feet, but the atmosphere had gone completely frigid. I stood in my tailored charcoal suit and watched as Preston slowly began to stir. He let out a low, gutted groan that sounded like a wounded animal surfacing from the dark. His perfectly styled hair was pressed flat against the hard ground, and his expensive linen suit was wrinkled and smeared, where he had gone down near a drop tray of catered food. He blinked up at a clear blue sky for a few blank seconds before the crushing weight of reality came flooding back. He gasped, pushing himself up onto his elbows. His eyes snapped immediately to the legal documents still drifting across the patio, the foreclosure notice, the federal indictment referral, the drafted conservatorship petition. It hadn't been a nightmare. Every page of it was violently real. Preston scrambled to his knees, his eyes sweeping the area in a panic. He looked toward the long teak dining table, searching for the three wealthy investors he needed to keep his illusion alive. The chairs were empty. The expensive crystal champagne flutes sat abandoned, still half full. The catering staff had stopped moving food and were quietly loading their silver trays into the white van, anxious to be clear of the disaster. The investors were gone, taking Preston's last hope of financial rescue with them. They had seen the federal fraud documents and walked off the estate without uttering a single word. Preston understood he was completely alone. The bridge loan had vanished. His reputation was ash. He crawled across the stone, his hands shaking so violently he could barely collect the scattered pages. He tried gathering the foreclosure notice and the fraud referral into a neat pile, as though organizing the paperwork could somehow reverse what had already been done. He looked up at me from his knees, every shred of his arrogant facade gone. He looked like a frightened child. His mouth opened to beg or to offer some hollow excuse, but he couldn't locate his voice. Claudia watched her husband kneeling on the ground in absolute ruin. The shock that had frozen her only moments before curdled rapidly into a blinding, desperate fury. She couldn't accept that their lavish life was finished, so she aimed every ounce of her rage directly at me. She crossed the patio with purpose, her designer heels hammering the stone like a metronome. She stopped inches from my face, her eyes wide and shot through with fury. "Look at what you did to him," she screamed, her voice fracturing into raw hysteria. "You malicious, bitter old man. You ruined his meeting. You made him collapse. I am calling the police right now. I am going to tell them you physically attacked him. I'll tell them you came out here in a psychotic rage and struck my husband. They will arrest you, Harold. They will drag you out of here in handcuffs and lock you in a cell where you belong." She plunged her hand into her expensive designer purse and pulled out her phone, fingers trembling as she prepared to dial. She was fully prepared to fabricate a felony assault charge against her own father just to hold on to her delusion of control. She wanted to make me pay for dragging the truth into the light. I did not step back. I did not raise my hands or scramble for a denial. I simply looked down at her with absolute pity. I waited until she had unlocked her phone screen before I spoke. "Go ahead and call them Claudia," I said, my voice perfectly level and still. "Tell them I assaulted him. Tell them I'm a violent threat. What you are about to hear is the moment everything shifts when the full weight of what had been done in secret finally lands. Before we get there, I want to ask you something. If you discovered that someone close to you had been quietly working against you, would you confront them face to face, or would you gather every piece of proof first and let the truth do the work? But before you make that call, I suggest you turn around and look up at the roofline of the guest house. Claudia's thumb froze over the screen. She turned her head slowly, following my gaze across the manicured lawn. Tucked neatly beneath the eaves of the small building were 3 high-definition security cameras. I had installed them months earlier when I first began to suspect Preston was rooting through my property, looking for financial documents. They were small black domes, invisible unless you knew precisely where to look. They have full audio and visual recording capability, I said, watching the color drain rapidly from her face. They transmit directly to a secure cloud server managed by my legal team. They recorded you and Preston standing on this patio just now, which proves I never laid a single finger on him. And more importantly, they captured everything that happened last night. They recorded Preston throwing a glass of freezing water directly into my face while you stood there and did nothing. They recorded my perfectly calm exit. Claudia lowered the hand holding the phone. The threat of calling the police dissolved instantly into the warm morning air. She stood staring at the small black domes and understood that every lie she had been preparing to feed the authorities was dead on arrival. If police came, they wouldn't be arresting me. They would pull the high-definition footage. They would see the unprovoked attack from the night before, and they would haul her husband away for elder abuse. She had tried to turn the law into a weapon against me without realizing I had already constructed an impenetrable wall of digital evidence around myself. Her mouth worked open and shut, but nothing came out. She was completely boxed in. She couldn't lie her way clear of this, and she couldn't bully me into backing down. The balance of power had shifted permanently in the span of a few minutes. I was no longer the frail, dependent father she could maneuver and discard at will. I was the architect of their total ruin, and I had anticipated every desperate move they would attempt. I looked at the two of them one final time. Preston was still on the ground, clutching the documents that confirmed his guilt, and Claudia stood frozen in stunned silence. They had constructed an enormous house of cards on the foundation of my money and my name, and I had just quietly pulled that foundation out from under them. The terror in their eyes was total and undeniable, but I knew this was only the start of their long, grinding descent into reality. Preston scrambled away from the security cameras as though the small black domes were about to fire something at him. The existence of that digital trap had shattered his last remaining line of offense. He couldn't fight me physically, and he couldn't use the police to build a false story. He grabbed Claudia by the arm, his fingers biting into the expensive silk of her sleeve, and hauled her toward the massive sliding glass doors of the mansion. They retreated into the house like 2 panicked rats abandoning a sinking ship. I stayed on the patio, the morning sun resting on the shoulders of my tailored suit. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the sprawling living room, I watched the next phase of my carefully assembled plan execute itself with perfect precision. Preston was cutting frantic laps across the imported Persian rug, his hands raking through his perfectly styled hair. He was running entirely on the primal instincts of a cornered criminal. Every trace of the polished, successful entrepreneur had been burned away, leaving only a desperate man staring down decades in a federal penitentiary. He knew exactly what a federal indictment referral meant. He knew that authorities would eventually come knocking on his massive custom oak front door, and he knew he couldn't be sitting in that living room when they did. His mind was running through his shrinking list of escape options. He needed a ruthless defense attorney who charged $10,000 a day, or he needed a private jet pointed at a country with no extradition treaty. Both of those routes required one specific thing, and he still believed he had access to it. He needed immediate liquid cash. I watched him dig into the pocket of his wrinkled linen trousers and produce his smartphone. His hands were shaking so badly, he nearly fumbled the device onto the hardwood floor. He was sweating heavily, dragging the back of his hand across his forehead as he fought to unlock the screen. The facial recognition failed to read his features because his face was twisted beyond recognition by panic. He had to punch in his passcode manually, his trembling thumbs bouncing off the wrong numbers twice before he finally broke through into his digital life. Preston pulled up his primary banking application. This was the master account, a high-yield private wealth portfolio, where he kept what remained of his legitimate earnings tangled together with the enormous sums he had stolen using my forged signature. He intended to initiate an immediate wire transfer, sweeping every cent into an untraceable offshore cryptocurrency wallet he had established months earlier. He waited for the loading screen to resolve, his eyes wide and unblinking. He expected to see a balance north of $2 million. He expected to see the financial safety net he had built on a foundation of fraud. The screen loaded and displayed his total available balance: zero. I could see the physical shockwave move through his entire body, even from my position on the patio. He stopped mid-stride and stood motionless, staring at the glowing display. He jabbed the refresh icon over and over, certain it was a network glitch or a rendering error. The small loading circle spun for a moment, then settled on the exact same devastating number: $0. Preston made a breathless, gutted sound and moved quickly to his secondary accounts. He opened the portal for his commercial real estate holding company, the account he used to service the enormous mortgage on his counterfeit mansion. It was completely frozen. He checked his high-limit platinum credit cards. Every available credit line had been revoked, the screens showing negative balances indicating the accounts were permanently locked. Every digital vault he reached for was sealed shut. He had no idea of the full scale of the legal trap Merritt had set around him. Preston thought he was navigating a standard civil dispute. He didn't know that, at precisely 8 hours that morning, Merritt had delivered a thick binder of forensic financial evidence to an emergency federal judge. The judge had reviewed the forged promissory notes, the shadow loans, and the incontrovertible proof of wire fraud. On the strength of that evidence, the judge had immediately granted an ex parte order, freezing every asset connected to Preston Voth and his network of affiliated shell companies, cutting off any possibility of dissipating the stolen funds. The legal guillotine had dropped hours before Preston even rolled out of bed to host his disastrous brunch. Preston's breathing turned ragged, his chest heaving beneath his ruined shirt. He dialed the direct line for his private wealth concierge at the bank. He paced near the large stone fireplace, the phone pressed hard against his ear. I watched his mouth moving fast as he demanded an immediate explanation. He was almost certainly screaming at the bank representative, threatening to pull his accounts and pursue the institution for restricting his funds. His tirade ran for exactly 10 seconds before the concierge responded. I couldn't hear what was being said on the other end, but I could read the precise moment the representative told Preston the truth about his situation. Preston stopped pacing. His shoulders caved forward as though something heavy had just been lowered directly onto the back of his neck. The representative was calmly explaining that the bank was complying fully with a federal freeze order tied to an active criminal fraud investigation. They informed him that his accounts were indefinitely suspended, that they could no longer do business with him, and that any further questions needed to be directed to federal authorities. Preston brought the phone down from his ear slowly. The screen went dark. He was completely severed from the global financial system. He couldn't move money to an offshore account. He couldn't retain a defense attorney to keep him out of prison. He couldn't even fill a gas tank to drive his luxury car off the estate. The trap was absolutely airtight. Claudia sensed that something had gone catastrophically wrong. She crossed to him, grabbing his arm and shaking it, demanding to know why he looked like he'd just seen a ghost. Preston turned to look at her, his eyes completely hollow. He told her the money was gone. I watched Claudia shake her head in sharp, furious denial. She refused to absorb the reality of their sudden and total poverty. She yanked her own gold-plated smartphone from her designer purse, her fingers flying with frantic urgency as she opened her personal banking applications. Claudia had always kept separate accounts to bankroll her extravagant shopping habits and imported wine deliveries. She assumed her money was untouched because she had convinced herself she was walled off from her husband's chaotic business dealings. She logged into her primary checking account. She stared at the screen, her mouth dropping open in a silent scream. Her balance was also absolute zero. Merritt had not overlooked a single detail. My legal team had thoroughly documented Claudia co-signing the fraudulent loan applications. By knowingly putting her name on the forged documents, she had made herself fully and personally liable for the stolen funds. The federal judge had not hesitated for a moment before folding her personal assets into the emergency freeze order. She was a full co-conspirator, and she was now staring down the exact same financial obliteration as her husband. Claudia let the phone slip from her hand onto the hardwood floor. The screen fractured with a sharp crack, a fitting metaphor for her collapsing existence. She seized the lapels of Preston's jacket, screaming into his face and hammering his chest with her fists. She was demanding that he fix it, demanding that he somehow conjure the millions of dollars they needed to survive. But Preston just absorbed her blows with a vacant, defeated stare. He had nothing left to give her. The illusion he had been selling her was completely bankrupt. I watched them turn on each other in the center of the enormous living room, the grand chandelier hanging above them, pouring brilliant light down onto their misery. They were locked inside a cage built entirely from their own greed. They couldn't fight their way out. They couldn't run. They couldn't spend their way clear of the consequences. The legal trap had snapped its steel jaws shut around them, breaking their future cleanly in two. I turned away from the glass and felt a deep, cold satisfaction settle into my chest like stone. I walked back toward the guest house at a measured pace, leaving them to tear each other apart in the wreckage of their counterfeit kingdom. I poured a glass of cold water and settled into the leather armchair near the front window. I knew Claudia wouldn't surrender easily. Her entire world had just been dismantled, and people like her don't stop to examine their mistakes when they are cornered. They reach for whatever weapon is closest. I watched the long driveway stretching up to the estate, knowing she was somewhere inside that mansion, right now hunting for a way to come at me. It took exactly 20 minutes for her retaliation to show up. The flashing red and blue lights of two police cruisers sliced through the quiet morning air, strobing hard against the tall oaks and the imported stone facade of the mansion. The vehicles angled to a stop near the front steps, sirens off, but lights still sweeping the manicured lawns in frantic color. 4 officers stepped out, hands resting loosely on their duty belts. They had taken an emergency call from a wealthy address about a violent domestic disturbance, and they were expecting chaos and danger. I set my water glass on the table, stood, and smoothed the front of my charcoal suit. I was at the front door before they had even reached the porch. I pulled it open and stepped out into the morning light. 2 officers were crossing the lawn toward me at a brisk pace. Claudia was right behind them, delivering the performance of her life. Her designer sundress was deliberately disheveled, and she had smeared her expensive makeup to manufacture the convincing appearance of desperate, frantic tears. She leveled a trembling finger directly at my chest. "Officers, that's him!" She cried, her voice calibrated perfectly to the pitch of a terrified victim. "He's having a complete psychotic break. He came out to the patio this morning and violently attacked my husband. He shoved Preston to the ground and threatened to kill us. He has severe dementia, and he's become completely unhinged. You need to arrest him and place him on an involuntary psychiatric hold right now before he hurts someone else." The lead officer, a tall man with a sharp, assessing expression, stepped onto the porch and raised a firm hand to hold Claudia back. He looked directly at me, sizing up the supposed threat. He had clearly been expecting to find a disoriented, agitated elderly man in some state of distress. What he found instead was a perfectly composed 65-year-old in a bespoke suit, standing straight and radiating complete authority. "Good morning, officers," I said, keeping my voice level and unhurried. "Please come inside. There is absolutely no cause for alarm." The officer paused for just a beat, reading my calm before stepping across the threshold into the guest house. Claudia moved to follow him, desperate to keep her fabricated story breathing. But I shifted slightly in the doorway, cutting off her path. "I'm sorry, Claudia, but you are no longer welcome in my home," I said plainly. The second officer turned and firmly directed her to stay on the lawn, which only sharpened her fury. She crossed her arms and fixed me with a look of undiluted hatred through the open doorway, the manufactured tears vanishing entirely. "Sir, we received a serious emergency call stating you physically assaulted your son-in-law," the lead officer said, producing a small black notepad. "Do you understand these are very serious criminal allegations?" I held his gaze and gave a slow nod. "I understand perfectly, officer," I replied. "My daughter is currently attempting to manufacture a domestic violence charge because she and her husband are facing complete financial ruin this morning. If you look at the roofline directly above the door outside, you'll see 3 high-definition security cameras. They record continuously to a secure cloud server. I'd invite you to review this morning's footage right now. You'll see that I never came within 5 feet of Preston Voth. You'll simply see him collapsing onto the patio from the shock of reading a legal document I handed him. And if you review last night's footage, you'll see Preston Voth throwing a glass of ice water directly into my face in a completely unprovoked attack." The officer stopped writing. He stepped to the doorway and looked up at the roofline, located the small black domes, then turned back to study my perfectly pressed suit. His posture eased noticeably. He recognized that the hysterical woman on the lawn had almost certainly filed a false police report to bend them to her purpose. Claudia saw her story unraveling. She started shouting from the grass the cameras were fake. I was a manipulative liar who had planted them to spy on her family. I ignored every word of it. I crossed to the small mahogany desk in the corner of the room and slid open the top drawer. I set the false assault allegation aside entirely and moved straight to the decisive blow. I have no interest in pursuing battery charges against my son-in-law for the water incident, I told the officers as I turned back around. I am, however, very interested in formally reporting a significant federal crime that has been carried out on this property over the last 6 months. I held up a small silver USB drive, walked over, and set it carefully on the center of the coffee table. This drive contains irrefutable forensic evidence of wire fraud, bank fraud, and aggravated identity theft. I said, Preston Voth has forged my signature on multiple high-value promissory notes, stealing nearly $1.5 million from private equity lenders. My legal counsel, Merritt, submitted this exact evidence to a federal judge early this morning, resulting in a full asset freeze on both Preston and Claudia Voth. The lead officer stared at the silver drive. Local patrol officers don't typically wade into million-dollar federal fraud cases, but the specific mention of a federal judge and an active asset freeze shifted the entire nature of their visit. Sir, if what you're telling us is accurate, this is a matter for federal investigators, the officer said, carefully, clearly recognizing he had walked into the middle of a serious corporate crime scene. I agreed with a slight nod. I understand that, officer. However, Preston Voth is currently inside that mansion, desperate and completely stripped of his financial resources. He is a serious flight risk. I am formally requesting that you detain him for questioning regarding the identity theft and the false police report his wife just filed to cover their escape. The officer keyed his shoulder radio and contacted dispatch requesting a direct line to the federal courthouse to confirm the emergency injunction I had described. The radio crackled with static for 2 long, grinding minutes. Outside, Claudia stood on the lawn, her fabricated tears fully dried up, as a new wave of very real panic moved across her face. She could hear the radio traffic crackling from the officer's shoulder unit. She knew the truth was closing in at harrowing speed, and there was absolutely nothing she could do to stop the machinery I had already set in motion. The dispatch operator finally responded, confirming the active federal freeze order tied to Preston Voth and his network of affiliated holding companies. The operator also noted that the local precinct had already been contacted to assist federal agents who were currently en route to the estate. The lead officer looked back at me, a quiet, settled respect moving into his expression. He picked up the silver USB drive and secured it in his uniform pocket. Thank you for your full cooperation. Mr. Crane, he said, his tone entirely professional, scrubbed clean of any earlier suspicion. Please stay here in the guest house. We're going to speak with Mr. Voth right now. The 2 officers walked out of the guest house and moved with purpose directly across the lawn toward the mansion's massive front doors. Claudia tried to chase after them, crying out for them to stop, pleading with them to hear her fabricated story about my dementia one more time. They paid her no attention whatsoever, their focus fixed entirely on those front doors. I stepped out onto the porch and watched the final act of their counterfeit life play out. Preston had apparently spotted the police cruisers from an upstairs window and mistakenly believed Claudia had successfully executed her plan. He walked out through the front doors with full confidence, expecting to find me being loaded into the back of a cruiser in restraints. The smug, arrogant grin had even begun to creep back across his face. Instead, the 2 officers seized his arms the instant he stepped onto the porch. They wheeled him around hard, driving his chest against the expensive custom oak door. The metallic snap of the steel handcuffs rang out across the quiet estate, the most satisfying sound I had ever heard in my life. Preston shouted in raw shock, demanding to know what was happening, insisting he was a wealthy property owner, and that they were making a catastrophic mistake. The officers read him his rights in a firm, clear voice, stating he was being detained on suspicion of federal fraud and filing a false police report. They walked him down the stone steps, his designer shoes stumbling on the concrete, and pushed him into the back of the waiting cruiser. Claudia dropped to her knees on the grass, wailing as she watched her husband being taken away like a street criminal. She had tried to use the law as her final weapon against me, and the recoil had just demolished her entire world. The cruisers pulled away from the estate, carrying Preston toward a concrete holding cell and leaving Claudia completely alone on the lawn of a mansion she no longer owned. The heavy oak front door drifted open slightly behind her, swaying in the late morning breeze. Claudia stood motionless on the manicured lawn, watching the dust settle on the long asphalt driveway where the police vehicles had just disappeared. She was utterly alone. For the first time in 3 years, the vast luxury estate felt completely hollow. She walked slowly back up the imported stone steps and stepped into the grand foyer. The house had been meticulously designed as a monument to wealth and corporate power, but standing inside it now, it felt like nothing more than a beautifully decorated tomb. She moved through the expansive living room, stepping over the shattered remains of her gold-plated smartphone lying on the antique Persian rug. The catering staff had long since fled, leaving the patio doors hanging wide open, the remnants of the expensive brunch going stale in the warming sun. Claudia drew her arms around herself, feeling a sudden chill despite the heat of the day. She tried to convince herself this was all some terrible temporary misunderstanding. She told herself that Preston would leverage his connections, retain a brilliant defense attorney, and have the fraud allegations sorted out before dinner. She clung to the brittle delusion that she was still the lady of the house, and that her father was simply staging a vindictive tantrum she could eventually manage. She drifted into the massive gourmet kitchen, intending to pour herself a glass of imported sparkling water to steady her nerves. She reached for the heavy stainless steel handle of the oversized custom refrigerator. The moment her fingers touched the cold metal, the steady low hum of the appliance cut out completely. A second later, the recessed lighting above the marble island flickered once and died. The digital displays on the double ovens went black. The soft rush of the central air conditioning faded into total silence. The enormous house was swallowed instantly by a heavy, suffocating stillness. Claudia stood in the darkened kitchen, her heart slamming against her ribs. She stabbed the gold-plated light switch on the wall over and over, but nothing responded. She crossed to the deep porcelain sink and pushed the chrome handle up. A hollow hiss of air escaped the faucet, followed by a few pathetic drops, before the line went bone dry. She walked back into the living room, grabbed the wireless landline handset from its charging base on the console table, and pressed it to her ear, expecting a dial tone. She had every intention of calling the utility company to unleash her fury on a customer service representative. The line was completely dead. Merritt had not simply frozen their bank accounts and triggered a federal investigation. He had methodically dismantled the entire invisible infrastructure propping up their counterfeit life. For 3 years, my blind trust had quietly paid every utility bill, property tax, and maintenance fee required to keep that massive estate running. Preston and Claudia were so blinded by their own arrogance that they never once asked themselves why the electricity and water kept flowing without them ever writing a check. The moment I gave Merritt the green light, he canceled every account connected to that property address without hesitation. The shock of the blackout drove straight through Claudia's thick wall of denial. She was stranded in a dark, silent house with no running water, no working phone, no money, and a husband sitting in a federal holding cell. But instead of feeling remorse or arriving at any real clarity, she felt a familiar surge of raw entitlement. She funneled her rising panic directly into fury, and she aimed that fury entirely at me. She convinced herself that I had physically gone to the main breaker box in the guest house and cut the power out of pure spite. She flatly refused to accept that the frail old man she had spent years mistreating possessed the reach to sever her from the outside world so completely. She stormed out the back door of the mansion, her designer heels grinding against the gravel path toward my small residence. She was coming over to demand that I restore the power. She intended to scream at me, tell me she was the innocent victim of Preston's lies, and insist I open my wallet to repair her ruined life. She crossed the manicured lawn with her face twisted into a mask of ugly, unfiltered rage. She reached the small wooden porch of the guest house and didn't bother to knock. She grabbed the brass doorknob, wrenched it hard, and threw the heavy door open with her shoulder. "Harold!" She screamed, her voice ricocheting through the open doorway. "Turn the power back on right now and get out here." She stepped boldly over the threshold, fully primed to unleash a torrent of abuse, but the words shriveled and died in her throat. The guest house was completely silent. The air inside felt oddly stale, none of the familiar smell of my dark roast brewing, none of the scent of the old leather-bound books I used to read through every afternoon. Claudia blinked, adjusting to the dim light sifting through the closed blinds. She moved further into the small living room and stopped dead. The room had been stripped bare. The worn armchair where I used to sit and watch television was gone. The small wooden dining table where I took my modest meals was gone. The antique rug had been rolled up and carried out, leaving nothing but bare hardwood. She panicked and ran down the short hallway into the single bedroom. It was emptied entirely. The wooden bed frame had been taken apart. The mattress was gone, and the closet doors stood open wide, showing nothing but bare wooden hangers and empty shelves. I had not simply packed a bag and walked away. I had erased every physical trace of my presence from that property. While she had been occupied watching her husband get handcuffed and marched down the front steps, a specialized private moving crew, hired by Merritt, had slipped in quietly through the hidden rear access road. They had packed my entire life into their truck in under 30 minutes and disappeared without a trace. I left behind no stray sock, no forgotten book, no single photograph. I had surgically removed myself from her world. Claudia stumbled backward, the breath seizing painfully in her throat. The cold logistical precision of my exit finally pierced through her towering arrogance. I wasn't lingering in the garden. I wasn't somewhere close by, waiting for her to come around. I was gone completely and permanently. She walked back into the vacant living room, her legs shaking beneath her as the full weight of her isolation came crashing down. As she turned to go, she caught sight of a single sheet of crisp white paper, taped firmly to the inside of the front door, positioned exactly at eye level. It was the only thing remaining in the entire building. She moved toward it slowly, reading the bold black letters printed across the top of the page. Official notice to vacate. It was a formal legal eviction order, executed by the corporate holding company that now held lawful possession of the foreclosed estate. The document spelled out in cold, unsparing legal language that the current occupants had precisely 72 hours to collect all personal belongings and clear the premises entirely. It specified that the property had been reclassified as a seized asset on account of severe mortgage default and active federal fraud investigations. The notice made explicitly clear that failure to comply would trigger forced physical removal by the county sheriff's department and the immediate confiscation and auction of any personal property left behind inside the mansion. Claudia stared at the page, her eyes running over those terrifying words again and again, as though the black ink might somehow rearrange itself if she looked hard enough. There was no hidden loophole. There was no generous grace period. There was no wealthy, forgiving father waiting in the wings to absorb her enormous debts and reassure her that everything would be fine. She reached out and pressed her fingers against the heavy paper, her trembling hand tracing the sharp edges of the legal seal stamped at the bottom. The absolute finality of it broke her completely. She had surrendered a billion-dollar inheritance and the unconditional love of a devoted father for a fraudulent husband and a counterfeit mansion she was about to be forcibly thrown out of. She slowly slid down the smooth wooden door, her back dragging against the hard surface, until she was sitting flat on the bare floor of the empty guest house. She pulled her knees up tight against her chest and buried her face in her hands. And then she began to cry. Not the calculated manufactured tears she had deployed against the police officers just hours before. These were the raw, gutting sobs of a woman who had just fully understood that she had destroyed her own life in a way that could not be undone. The silent war was officially over. I had won without ever once raising my voice, and she was left sitting entirely alone in the dark, hollow wreckage of her own catastrophic defeat. Federal courthouses are intentionally designed to make a person feel incredibly small. The soaring marble pillars, the dense mahogany doors, the sharp crack of footsteps across polished stone, all of it engineered to strip away whatever fragile illusions of grandeur a person has carried through the front door. It is a place where counterfeit realities go to die. I walked through the metal detectors on Tuesday morning in my tailored charcoal suit, with Merritt moving quietly at my side. We weren't there to take part in the proceedings. My legal team had already delivered the massive binders of forensic evidence directly to the federal prosecutor. I was there for one reason only: to witness the absolute conclusion of the silent war I had waged against my own family. We entered the courtroom and settled into the very last row of the wooden gallery benches. The room was sharply cold, carrying a faint smell of floor wax and old paper. I sat perfectly still, hands resting on my lap. 3 rows ahead, sitting entirely alone, was Claudia. I took a long moment and simply looked at the back of my daughter's head. She was wearing the same designer sundress she'd had on at the patio during Preston's disastrous brunch, but now it was badly wrinkled and stained. Her normally immaculate hair had been pulled into a loose, careless knot, and her shoulders were pitched forward in defeat. She looked like a woman who hadn't slept or eaten in days. She had been forcibly evicted from the mansion 24 hours earlier. With her bank accounts frozen solid, she was most likely sleeping in her car or reaching out to old friends for somewhere to stay. The friends she had purchased with my money had almost certainly disappeared the moment the federal freeze order went public. She was in full freefall into sudden poverty, and she had no tools whatsoever to survive it. The heavy wooden door beside the judge's bench swung open, and a bailiff stepped into the room. He instructed everyone to rise. The federal judge, a stern woman with sharp eyes and an expression of absolute intolerance for nonsense, took her seat at the elevated bench. She adjusted her reading glasses and opened the massive file folder resting in front of her. The thing was so thick it could have passed for a dictionary. It held every single financial sin Preston Volth had committed over the last 6 months. "Bring in the defendant," the judge commanded, her voice cutting through the silent courtroom like a steel blade. The side door leading to the federal holding cells opened with a loud metallic clank. 2 armed federal marshals escorted Preston Volth into the courtroom. The transformation was absolutely breathtaking. The arrogant young visionary who had flung freezing water into my face was gone without a trace. In his place stood a broken, frightened man dressed in a standard-issue bright orange prison jumpsuit. His wrists were locked in heavy steel handcuffs attached to a chain running around his waist. He shuffled awkwardly forward, his expensive Italian leather shoes replaced by cheap slip-on canvas sneakers. He had spent the previous 3 nights in a concrete cell alongside actual violent criminals, and the experience had completely shattered whatever remained of his ego. His face was pale and unshaven. He looked physically diminished, as though the sheer gravity of what was coming had compressed him somehow. He took his seat beside a visibly worn public defender. Because his accounts were entirely frozen, Preston had no way to retain the kind of aggressive, expensive defense attorney he so desperately needed. He was left with a court-appointed lawyer who was overworked, underpaid, and running on fumes. Preston turned his head sharply, scanning the rows of gallery benches. He was searching for Claudia, grasping for some scrap of comfort or reassurance. He found her and managed a pathetic, trembling smile. Then his eyes tracked to the back row and landed on me. I didn't glare at him. I didn't smile. I simply looked at him with the flat, detached calm of a man examining a piece of damaged cargo. Preston physically flinched the moment our eyes met. He snapped his head forward and fixed his gaze on the judge's heavy wooden desk. He knew I was the architect of the cage he was sitting inside. The judge looked down at the prosecutor, then at the public defender. "We are here for the bail hearing of Mr. Preston Volth," she stated flatly. "The charges are extensive. Multiple counts of federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, bank fraud, and the filing of a false police report. Counselor, I will hear your argument for bail." The public defender rose, tugging at the lapels of his cheap suit jacket. His voice carried no conviction. "Your Honor, my client is a local business owner with deep ties to this community." The public defender continued, his tone hollow. "He has no prior criminal record. The charges against him arise from a complex series of commercial real estate transactions that simply went bankrupt. He made some terrible accounting errors during a period of extreme financial stress, but he poses no violent threat to society. He is a married man. We are requesting a reasonable bond so he can return to his family and mount a proper defense against these complex financial allegations." The judge absorbed the plea without a flicker of expression. She looked down at the massive binder Merritt had provided. She turned a page slowly, the sound of thick paper cutting through the quiet room. "Accounting errors." The judge repeated, her voice heavy with contempt. "Counselor, I have sat on the federal bench for 20 years. I have seen men rob banks with shotguns, and I have seen men rob pensions with fountain pens. Your client did not make an accounting error. He executed a highly calculated, predatory, and malicious scheme of identity theft." The judge turned her full attention to Preston. "Stand up, Mr. Volth," she commanded. Preston rose slowly, the heavy steel chains at his waist rattling against the wooden table. He kept his head down, staring at his canvas shoes. "I have spent the entire morning reviewing the forensic financial evidence provided to this court." The judge continued, her voice gaining in volume and intensity. The sheer audacity of your crimes is genuinely staggering. You forged the signature of your 65-year-old father-in-law on multiple promissory notes. You used his identity to secure over $1.5 million in unregulated shadow loans to fund a fraudulent cryptocurrency scheme. You submitted fabricated tax returns and manipulated digital notary seals. That is not an accounting error, Mr. Voth. That is a deliberate, sustained attack on the federal banking system. Claudia sat motionless in the gallery. She was hearing the exact numbers being read into the official court record. She was hearing a federal judge validate every single piece of evidence I had placed before Preston on that patio. The fragile wall of denial she had constructed around herself was being methodically torn down by the highest authority in the room. But the judge wasn't finished. The financial fraud was only the foundation of her contempt. However, the judge said, leaning forward over the heavy wooden bench, what I find truly reprehensible is the nature of your victim. You did not simply defraud private equity firms. You actively preyed upon an elderly family member who was living on your property. The evidence submitted to this court includes high-definition video footage from the night before your arrest. I watched you throw a glass of ice water into the face of an older gentleman who was doing nothing more than refusing to hand over the deed to his home. I watched you humiliate him. I watched you threaten to throw him into the street. You treated your own father-in-law as though he were completely expendable. Preston closed his eyes, a single tear breaking free and sliding down his pale cheek. He was being publicly dissected. The illusion of the successful visionary had been extinguished entirely, and the reality of the man he truly was had been laid bare before the entire room. The judge lifted a specific document from the file. It was the drafted conservatorship petition I had pulled from his corporate servers. And perhaps the most sickening piece of evidence in this entire binder is this drafted legal petition. She said, her voice tightening with righteous fury. When you realized you could no longer bully him into signing away his property, you conspired to have him declared mentally incompetent. You planned to stand before a probate judge and lie under oath to strip him of his most basic rights as a human being so you could plunder what remained of his assets. You attempted to turn the legal system itself into a weapon to conceal your financial crimes. The judge set the paper down and removed her reading glasses. She looked at Preston with cold, unwavering contempt. Your public defender describes you as a successful business owner, the judge said. But the financial disclosures tell an entirely different story. You are completely bankrupt. Your commercial properties are in default. Your primary residence is presently being foreclosed upon. And you have zero access to liquid capital. But the single most catastrophic miscalculation you made, Mr. Voth, was underestimating the man you were trying to destroy. This was the moment the ground shifted permanently beneath Claudia's feet. She leaned forward slightly on her wooden bench, her breath catching sharply in her throat. She had always believed I was a pathetic burden. She was about to discover the true scale of the titan she had crossed. The court has reviewed the ownership structure of the holding company that initiated the foreclosure on your estate. The judge continued reading from a confidential financial summary provided by Merritt. The court has also verified the origin of the forensic audit that exposed your crimes. You believed you were stealing from a broke, vulnerable widower. You did not realize that Harold Crane is the sole beneficiary of a blind trust valued at over $800 million. He is the former chief executive officer of Crane Global Logistics. He secretly held the mortgage on your home. He funded your entire lavish lifestyle from the shadows. You tried to steal $1 million from a man who possesses nearly $1 billion. You brought a forged piece of paper to a war against a financial giant. A collective gasp moved through the small gallery. The public defender slowly turned his head and stared at his own client in pure disbelief. Preston swayed on his feet, his knees buckling slightly under the crushing weight of the revelation. He had thrown water into the face of a billionaire. He had called the man who secretly owned his entire world a freeloader. The sheer scale of his miscalculation was so vast, it defied all comprehension. But the reaction that mattered most to me belonged to Claudia. I watched her back go, rigid. Her hands seized the wooden bench in front of her so tightly her knuckles drained completely white. The judge's words struck her with the force of a localized earthquake. 800 million. The number hung in the cold air of the courtroom. Claudia's mind was frantically working to absorb it. She understood now that I had not been living in the guest house out of poverty. I had been there by choice. I had endured her condescending remarks, her coldness, and her husband's abuse simply to put her loyalty to the test. She understood that if she had offered me even a fragment of basic human decency, if she had treated me like a father rather than a burden she would have one day inherited an empire, she would have been free from financial worry for the rest of her life. Instead, she had co-signed fraudulent loans to steal a pitiful fraction of what would have been given to her freely. She had exchanged a vast generational fortune for a counterfeit designer lifestyle that had delivered her nothing but complete eviction and an approaching criminal indictment. The full weight of her catastrophic choices crashed down on her all at once. Her shoulders began to shake, and a low, wrenching sob broke from her throat. The judge's wooden gavel cracked sharply against the sound block, cutting through the murmurs rising in the courtroom. "Mr. Voth, you are facing decades in a federal penitentiary," the judge declared, her voice ringing with absolute finality. "You have demonstrated a highly sophisticated capacity to manipulate financial systems and perpetrate fraud. You have no home to return to. You have no legitimate business ties. You are the very definition of a severe flight risk and a continuing danger to the financial community. Therefore, bail is categorically denied. You will be remanded to the custody of the United States Marshals and held in federal lockup until your trial." Preston let out a desperate, terrified wail. He lunged forward against the wooden table, pleading with the judge for a second chance, begging for house arrest, screaming that he would not survive inside a federal prison. The two armed marshals seized him by the shoulders and hauled him backward. The heavy steel chains clattered violently as he fought against their hold. They dragged him away from the defense table, his canvas sneakers scraping uselessly across the polished floor. He twisted to look back over his shoulder as they pulled him toward the side door. He was not looking at the judge. He was looking directly at me. His eyes were wide with raw, undiluted terror. He finally understood that I hadn't simply taken his money. I had taken his freedom, his dignity, and whatever future he had imagined for himself. The heavy steel door slammed shut behind him, cutting off his screams and sealing his fate entirely. The judge closed the massive file folder. "We are adjourned," she said, stepping down from the bench and disappearing into her private chambers. The courtroom began to empty around us. Merritt rose, buttoned his suit jacket, and nodded toward the main doors. We walked together down the center aisle. As we passed the third row, Claudia slowly turned her head and looked up at me. Her face was completely streaked with darkened mascara and tears. Her eyes were hollow, carved out by a mixture of profound regret and absolute terror. She knew the federal agents would be coming for her next. She knew her signature was on those documents. She parted her lips to speak. She wanted to beg. She wanted to call me Dad. She wanted to ask for forgiveness, or a high-priced attorney, or simply a warm place to sleep that night. But I didn't stop walking. I didn't break my stride. I looked directly into her eyes for the span of a single breath, long enough for her to see the cold, impenetrable steel that had taken the place of my heart. I gave her absolutely nothing. No anger, no pity, and no salvation. I simply walked past her, leaving her alone on that hard wooden bench to face every consequence her own monstrous greed had earned her. Exactly 7 days had passed since the gavel fell in that freezing federal courtroom. I spent the entire week finalizing the liquidation of my remaining shell companies and moving the vast majority of my liquid assets into secure philanthropic trusts. It was a Tuesday afternoon when I finally stepped out through the towering glass lobby of Merritt's law firm, situated at the absolute center of the financial district. A heavy gray rain was washing the city streets, driving a bitter chill through the concrete canyons. I stood beneath the deep architectural awning of the building, adjusting the thick collar of my charcoal cashmere overcoat, while I waited for my private driver to bring the town car around to the curb. The world around me felt remarkably quiet and settled, but the ghosts of my recent past weren't entirely ready to release me. I noticed a solitary figure huddled against the cold granite wall near the far edge of the awning. She was soaked through, shaking hard in the damp afternoon chill. She had on a thin beige trench coat over cheap gray sweatpants, a jarring, pitiful contrast to the imported silk gowns and custom tailoring she used to display around the luxury estate. Her hair was plastered flat against her pale face in wet, dark ropes. It was Claudia. She had been out here in the freezing rain for God knows how long, tracking my movements, or perhaps simply staking out the one location she knew I still came to. When she saw me push through the heavy revolving doors, she shoved herself off the wet granite and lurched forward. She no longer moved with the arrogant, entitled stride of a wealthy heiress. She moved like a desperate, frightened beggar. Before I could even lift a hand to signal the building security standing just inside the glass, she had crossed the distance between us and collapsed onto the wet pavement directly at my feet. The cold rainwater pooled around her knees and soaked through her thin clothing, but she didn't seem to register it at all. She reached out and seized the hem of my charcoal cashmere overcoat, her hands pale blue and trembling from the cold. The tears came immediately mixing with the heavy rain streaming down her face. She looked up at me, her eyes wide and bloodshot, begging for a salvation she had done absolutely nothing to deserve. "Daddy, please!" She sobbed, her voice breaking and bouncing off the smooth glass face of the building. "Please just look at me. You have to hear me out. I am so sorry. I am so incredibly sorry for everything that happened." I did not pull my coat from her grip, but I didn't reach down to lift her up either. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the very woman who had cheerfully co-signed fraudulent documents to steal my identity and have me committed to a secure psychiatric ward. I had no idea what he was doing. Claudia wept, shaking her head to underscore her manufactured innocence. Preston manipulated me. He controlled every single aspect of our lives. You know how aggressive he gets. You saw him hurl that freezing water in your face just last week. I was completely terrified of him, Daddy. He put those complicated loan documents in front of me and forced me to sign. I never read them. I never wanted to hurt you or take your money. He lied to me the same way he lied to you and to those investors. I am a victim too. He destroyed my entire life and left me with absolutely nothing. I listened closely to her desperate theatrical performance, paying careful attention to the specific words she reached for. She was a masterful deflector. She was frantically trying to rewrite what had actually happened, casting herself as a helpless hostage rather than a willing and enthusiastic accomplice in a federal crime. She conveniently forgot the cold, condescending remarks she had made to me in the kitchen. She forgot telling me I owed them for my room and board. She forgot standing by with a smirk while her husband humiliated me in front of his guests. Now that Preston was locked inside a federal holding cell and entirely worthless to her financial future, she was perfectly happy to throw him under the bus to preserve herself. "I have absolutely nowhere to go," Claudia wailed, her grip tightening frantically on the heavy fabric of my coat. "The bank took my car yesterday morning. Every account I have is frozen. Every single one of my friends has blocked my number. I spent the last 3 nights on a hard plastic chair in a public bus terminal. I am starving, and I am so unbearably cold. Please, Daddy, I know you have money. I heard what the federal judge said in that courtroom. You are a billionaire. You can make all of this go away with one phone call. Just get me a small apartment. Pay my rent for a few months until I can get back on my feet and find work. I will do whatever you want. I will look after you. We can be a real family again. Please do not leave me out here to die in the street." Her begging climbed to a frantic pitch, her voice carrying down the busy metropolitan sidewalk. A few pedestrians in expensive business suits hurried past, casting uncomfortable sidelong looks at the scene playing out beneath the awning. Claudia was actively weaponizing her suffering, working to trigger the deep paternal instinct I had carried and tended for decades. She was deliberately using the word daddy, a title she hadn't said with any genuine warmth since she was 10 years old. She believed that beneath my cold exterior, there was still a soft and forgiving father who couldn't bear to watch his little girl live with the consequences of her own choices. She genuinely thought that my wealth meant my forgiveness was something she could simply demand through a theatrical display of anguish. She assumed a handful of tears and a story about being manipulated by her husband would instantly wipe away the profound evil she had committed against me. She looked up at me, her face twisted into a mask of calculated suffering, waiting for me to crack. She was waiting for me to reach down, pull her close, and promise her the nightmare was over. She was waiting for the unconditional financial rescue she had received her entire life. I looked at her trembling hands clutching my expensive coat. I looked at the dirty rain washing the last traces of expensive makeup from her pale face. I did not feel a single ounce of sympathy. The familiar hollow ache I used to carry whenever she was in pain had been fully and permanently excised from my soul. I saw straight through the performance. She was not crying because she had finally understood what a cruel, abusive daughter she had been. She was crying because she had permanently lost her limitless bank account. She was mourning the mansion, the designer wardrobe, and the imported wine. I was not a father to her in this moment. I was simply a human checkbook she was making one final desperate attempt to cash. I looked down at the woman, kneeling in the freezing rain, waiting for the familiar warmth of my forgiveness, waiting for the invisible net to catch her one last time. For 3 decades, I had rushed to repair every mistake she ever made. If she broke a toy, I bought a replacement. If she wrecked a car, I covered the deductible. I had constructed a vast wall of money around her life to shield her from the harshness of the world. And inside that comfortable fortress, she had grown into an absolute monster. I felt no anger anymore. The burning fury that had driven my calculated campaign over the past week had burned itself completely out, leaving behind nothing but a deep and heavy pity. She was a hollow shell entirely incapable of surviving the reality she had so deliberately created for herself. I reached down and gently freed the wet fabric of my charcoal cashmere overcoat from her desperate grip. She gasped sharply, looking up at me with wide, terrified eyes, finally understanding that the safety net was gone for good. I kept my voice just above the sound of the falling rain. I had no need to raise it to dismantle whatever illusions she had left. "I paid your rent for 30 years, Claudia." I said, my voice carrying the absolute finality of a judge handing down a life sentence. "I bought your clothes. I funded your luxury lifestyle. I paid for every single privilege you ever enjoyed. And it cost me my daughter. You traded my unconditional love for a bank account, and you traded my freedom for a fraudulent husband. I am not going to rescue you today. It is time you learned what things actually cost in the real world." A long, sleek black town car glided smoothly to the curb beside us, its tires hissing against the slick asphalt. The rear door swung open. Claudia let out a raw, agonizing scream, scrambling forward on her knees across the rough, wet pavement, desperately trying to grab hold of my hand-stitched leather derbies, begging for just one more chance. I stepped unhurriedly into the warm leather interior of the car, ignoring her entirely. I settled back against the plush seat and looked out through the open door. She was sobbing, without restraint, her hands reaching into the cold, empty space I had just left behind. I leaned forward and pressed the small silver button on the door panel. The heavy door pulled shut, with a solid, satisfying thud. The thick, tinted window rose smoothly and seamlessly, cutting off the sound of her frantic apologies and her desperate cries for her father. I did not look back as the driver eased the car away from the curb. I left her sitting entirely alone on the freezing sidewalk, abandoned at last, to face the absolute ruin of her own making. The air up here is entirely different. I sit on the sweeping terrace of my new penthouse apartment, 60 floors above the pulsing heart of the city. The traffic below registers as nothing more than a soft, distant murmur, completely powerless to reach the deep peace I have finally carved out for myself. The morning sun falls warm across the polished teak table where I sit alone. No imported marble islands, no screaming relatives, no elaborate lies. Just the crisp, clean air and the quiet satisfaction of a life fully reclaimed. In front of me rests a thick stack of finalized legal documents. They carry no forged signatures, no malicious petitions. They are the founding charter of the Crane Youth Educational Trust. I uncap my sterling silver fountain pen and sign my name carefully across the final page of the heavy document. With a single stroke of ink, I have permanently transferred the vast majority of my $800 million estate into a secure, irrevocable fund. This money will now deliver full university scholarships, housing, and living stipends to thousands of underprivileged young people across the country. I am directing my wealth toward men and women who genuinely understand what a dollar is worth. I am giving it to kids who have had to claw for every scrap of opportunity that has ever come their way. They will not squander this money on arrogant illusions, and they will not take it for granted. I am investing at last in a future I can actually be proud of. I set the pen down and ease back into my chair. I reach over and lift a heavy crystal glass resting near the documents. It is filled to the rim with ice water. I raise it toward the sunlight and watch the condensation bead along the surface of the clear glass. Just a few weeks ago, a glass of ice water was wielded as a weapon to humiliate me. It was meant to make me feel small, pathetic, and utterly without power. Now, I take a slow, deliberate sip. It tastes remarkably crisp and perfectly clean. It tastes like absolute victory. The silent adjustment is officially complete. I lost a daughter to the corrosive pull of unearned wealth, but I have gained thousands of children who will use my legacy to build lives that are genuine and full of meaning. Preston and Claudia are presently facing the harsh, unforgiving machinery of the federal justice system. They will spend years paying the steep price for their profound greed, while I spend my remaining days watching my real legacy take root and flourish. Family is not determined by blood, and that is where the road ends, not with a shout, not with a scene, just a car door closing and a man finally at peace. I think about what all of this cost. 3 years of swallowing my pride, living small, watching people I loved treat me like furniture. I believe God does not waste a single moment of suffering, that every quiet, painful season is building something the other person cannot yet see. What I lost in a daughter, I can never fully replace. But what I gained was clarity, and the freedom that comes when you stop carrying people who were never holding you up to begin with. If these father stories stay with you the way they stay with me, here is what I hope you take from this one. Never let anyone convince you that your silence means you have nothing left. Silence can be the sharpest tool in the room. If someone treats your love like a resource to drain, protecting yourself is not cruelty, it is wisdom. Document everything. A man with records and patience will always outlast a man with charm and shortcuts. And when the moment for Dad's revenge finally arrives, let the system do the work. Your job is simply to hand over the evidence and walk away clean. If this story moved you, leave a comment and tell me what hit hardest. If you know someone who is being taken advantage of by the very people who should be protecting them, share this with them. It might be exactly what they need to hear today. And if you have not yet subscribed to his Hidden Revenge, now is a good time. There is more where this came from. Thank you for sitting with me through this one. I will see you in the next story.